My stepmom demanded I cancel my wedding 2 days before, so my fiancé could marry my stepsister. But my grandma set a trap with fake $150,000 that exposed them all. I'm 25 years old. I work in an office doing admin stuff that honestly doesn't excite me but pays the bills. And I need to tell this story because what happened a few months ago literally destroyed my family. Or, well, what I thought was my family. The thing is, 2 days before my wedding, my stepmother, Ruth, asked me to cancel everything and convince my fiancé to marry my stepsister instead of me. Yes, you read that right. And when I say she asked me, I'm not talking about a casual suggestion. I'm talking about her showing up at the house I shared with Brandon, sitting down in my living room, and telling me with complete seriousness that I owed her this for raising me. But I guess I should start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without context. When I was 5 years old, I went to live with my dad. My biological mom. Well, let's just say she wasn't exactly Mother of the Year. I'm not going to get into details because that's a whole other story. But basically there was neglect, there was abuse, and there were enough social services interventions that my dad finally got full custody. I don't remember much from that time. Honestly, I guess my brain blocked most of those memories as a defense mechanism or something. But what I do remember perfectly is the first time I saw my dad's house. It was small, but clean. There was food in the fridge, and there was a bed just for me with sheets that smelled like fabric softener. Those things that, for any normal kid, are obvious, for me were like incredible luxuries. My dad worked a lot back then. He had like 2 jobs to be able to support both of us, and I think he was trying to establish some stability after years of legal battles with my biological mom. We spent about a year alone, just him and me, and they were good months, you know? He didn't know much about raising girls, obviously. Like he'd make me horrible braids and let me eat cereal for dinner more often than he probably should have, but he tried, and I loved him for that. And then he met Ruth. Ruth was like 25 years old at that time. I think. My dad was around his early 30s. She worked at the supermarket where my dad bought groceries, and they started talking and dating and all that stuff. At first I liked her, I guess. She was nice to me, brought me candy, let me help her bake cookies. And then my dad told me Ruth had a daughter, Samantha, who was 3 years old and had some health problems. I didn't really understand what that meant at the time because I was 6 and my concept of medical conditions was basically 0. But when I finally met Samantha, I saw she was in a wheelchair and needed help doing a lot of things. She had some kind of neurological condition. I never knew exactly what because nobody explained it to me in a way I could understand when I was a kid. But the thing is, it affected her mobility and development. My dad and Ruth got married about 6 months after they met, which, looking back, was super fast. But I guess they were both at that stage in their lives where they wanted stability and a complete family. Suddenly, we had this blended family, the 4 of us living in the same house. And I went from being an only child to having a younger sister who needed a lot of attention. And here comes the important part. Ruth always, and when I say always, I mean from day one, made it very clear to me that she had accepted me into her life, that she was raising me like her own daughter, and that I should be grateful for that. Not in a cruel way, you know? It was subtle. Like, every time there was a problem between Samantha and me, Ruth would say things like, "You need to be more understanding. She has special needs, and you should be grateful to be healthy." Or, "Remember everything we've done for you." Not all women would accept raising another woman's daughter. I grew up with this constant weight that I owed Ruth something just for existing in her space. My dad never saw it. Or if he saw it, he never said anything. He was so focused on keeping family peace and making sure Samantha had everything she needed medically that I think he didn't notice this whole weird dynamic Ruth was creating. Or maybe he did notice and just didn't want to deal with it. I don't know. The point is, I grew up feeling like I had to constantly earn my place in that family. Samantha and I had a complicated relationship. I didn't hate her or anything. She was my sister and I loved her. But Ruth always put us in indirect competition. If I got good grades, Ruth would say, "I wish Samantha could go to regular school like you." If I wanted to do some extracurricular activity, Ruth would remind me that money was limited because Samantha's therapies were expensive. Everything always came back to this thing where I had too much and Samantha had too little, and somehow it was my responsibility to compensate for that. When I was about 14, I met Brandon in middle school. He was that kind of guy who was nice to everyone, you know? Not super popular, but not the weird kid either. Just a good guy who made people laugh and helped others with math homework. We became friends almost immediately. We had chemistry that was obvious to everyone except ourselves at the time. He came to my house a lot to do homework or just hang out, and it was inevitable that he'd meet Samantha. She was like 12 then, and Brandon was super sweet with her. He talked to her normally, not with that condescending voice a lot of people use with people with disabilities, and he'd play video games with her and make her laugh. I thought it was great that my best friend and my sister got along. What I didn't anticipate was that Samantha would develop a massive crush on Brandon. And not just a little girl crush that goes away in 2 weeks. I'm talking about an obsession that Ruth actively fed. Like, Samantha had pictures of Brandon in her room, talked about him constantly, and Ruth totally went along with it. Like, she'd say things to her, like maybe someday Brandon will realize how special you are, or boys mature slowly. Give him time. I was 15, 16 years old, and didn't give it much importance because I thought it was something Samantha would naturally grow out of over time. Brandon and I started dating when we were 17, right before graduating high school. It was like everything finally clicked into place. You know? We'd been best friends for years, and suddenly we were something more, and it felt right and natural. But when I told my family, Ruth went livid. She didn't yell at me or anything, but she pulled me aside and told me I was selfish, that I knew perfectly well that Samantha loved Brandon, and how could I do this to my sister? Samantha cried for days, literally locked herself in her room and didn't want to talk to anyone, and Ruth blamed me for everything. My dad tried to mediate, saying, "You can't control who you fall in love with," and Samantha would have to accept it. But Ruth didn't let it go. For months, there was this horrible tension in the house. Brandon and I went to college together. Well, to universities in the same city. We lived in different dorms but spent all our free time together. We had this intense relationship like you only have when you're young and everything feels like life or death, you know? But we also had a lot of drama because neither of us really knew how to be in an adult relationship, and we both had our own stuff to process. I was dealing with years of feeling like a burden in my own family, and Brandon had his own family issues that aren't relevant right now. Anyway, we broke up after about 2 years. It was horrible and dramatic, and we both said things we regretted later, and then we just stopped talking to each other. I had no contact with Brandon for almost 3 years after that. I graduated, got my boring but stable job, moved to a small apartment, and was basically living this mediocre but functional life. I kept visiting my dad and Ruth regularly, although each visit was exhausting because Ruth always found ways to remind me that I was the adopted daughter and should be more present for Samantha. Samantha was like 21 at that point, still living at home, obviously because she needed constant care, and she still asked about Brandon occasionally, which was weird, but Ruth always said it was because he had been so good to her when we were teenagers. And then 2 years ago, I ran into Brandon at a coffee shop. It literally was like those cheesy movie scenes where you turn around and there the person is, you know? We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably just seconds. And then he smiled with that smile that had always melted me and said, "Hey, stranger." We sat down and talked for 4 hours, catching up on our lives, laughing about stupid things, and it was like no time had passed. He had matured a lot. I guess I had too. And we were both in different and better places than when we were 19 and broke our hearts. We started dating again about a month after that reunion. This time it was different, more stable, more adult. Brandon had a good job at a tech company. I had my life established, and we both knew enough not to fall into the same destructive patterns as before. We took things slow for several months before I told my family, because I knew Ruth was going to make a scene and I wanted to be sure this time was for real before getting into all that drama. When I finally told them Brandon and I were together again, Ruth literally got up from the dining room table and left without saying a word. My dad tried to act like everything was fine, but you could see in his face he knew a storm was coming. And he was right, because Samantha had an anxiety attack so bad they had to take her to the hospital that night. Ruth called me from the emergency room, screaming that I was a horrible person, that I knew what Brandon meant to Samantha, and how dare I do this to her again after everything they had done for me over the years. That was the moment where something changed in me. I was 24 years old. I wasn't a teenager who needed Ruth's approval anymore, and I was tired of feeling guilty for just living my life. I told Ruth I was sorry Samantha was suffering, but I wasn't going to end my relationship because my sister had unrequited feelings and she needed to stop treating me like I owed her my entire life. Ruth hung up on me. Things were tense for months after that. I kept visiting my dad, but Ruth barely spoke to me. And when she did, it was with this cold, cutting tone that made every visit uncomfortable. Samantha didn't want to see me, which hurt because despite everything I loved her and hated that she was suffering. But I also knew I had a right to be happy, and Brandon made me happy. He was incredibly patient through all of this. Never pressured me to choose between him and my family. Just supported me and reminded me I wasn't doing anything wrong. Brandon proposed to me about 8 months after we got back together. It was perfect. Nothing elaborate but meaningful for us, at the same coffee shop where we'd reconnected. I said yes before he finished formulating the complete question, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely, completely happy. I told my dad first, just him, and he got emotional and hugged me and told me Brandon was a good man and I deserved to be happy. Then I told Ruth and Samantha had another panic attack and locked herself in her room for 3 days. I decided I needed some space from all that family drama, so I moved completely out of my apartment and into Brandon's house. Technically, we weren't married yet, but we were adults and we loved each other, and frankly, I needed to be away from all the toxicity. Ruth called me to tell me I was leaving without considering the emotional impact on Samantha, and I basically told her Samantha would have to deal with her emotions with professional help because I couldn't put my life on pause indefinitely. That conversation didn't end well. We planned the wedding for 6 months after the engagement. Nothing big or fancy, just something small and intimate with close family and a few friends. My dad was going to walk me down the aisle. Ruth and Samantha were invited, although I didn't know if they'd come, and everything seemed to be on track decently. I'd accepted that my family would never be completely happy for me, but at least my dad supported me, and that was something. And then 2 days before the wedding, Ruth showed up at our house. Brandon was at work. I was packing the last things for the trip to where the ceremony would be, and suddenly Ruth is at my door. I opened it because, well, what else was I going to do? And she came in and sat on the couch with this expression I couldn't read at the time. I asked her if everything was okay, if something had happened with Samantha, and she said no. She just needed to talk to me about the wedding. What she said next was so absolutely unbelievable that I swear my brain took several seconds to process it. Ruth looked me directly in the eyes and told me I needed to cancel the wedding, and that I should tell Brandon I'd made a mistake and couldn't marry him. And here comes the part I still can't believe actually happened. She told me I needed to convince Brandon to marry Samantha instead of me. I stood there in my own living room, literally with my mouth open, unable to form words, and Ruth kept talking like what she was saying was completely reasonable. She told me Samantha loved Brandon, that she could never have a normal life or find someone else because of her disability, and that I owed this to Ruth for all the years she'd raised me. That she had treated me like her own daughter when she could have told my dad she didn't want to deal with the baggage of another woman's traumatized child. Things that I owed Samantha the chance to be happy because I'd had so many advantages in life that she'd never have. When I could finally speak, the only thing that came out of my mouth was something like, "Are you completely insane?" Ruth got angry immediately and started telling me I was ungrateful, that she knew I'd never really appreciated everything she'd done for me, and that this was my chance to finally prove I valued my family. I told her to get out of my house immediately, that what she was asking was absurd and sick, and that if she really thought I was going to give up my happiness to satisfy an impossible fantasy, then she clearly didn't know me at all. Ruth didn't leave right away. She sat there trying to reason with me, using all kinds of emotional manipulation tactics she'd probably perfected over years. She told me Brandon would probably feel the same about Samantha if he gave her a chance, that I was young and would find someone else, and that Samantha was literally getting sick from depression over this, and I could save her if I wanted to. Every word that came out of her mouth made me feel more and more sick. I finally told her if she didn't leave my house in the next 30 seconds, I was going to call the police. She got up, looked at me with this pure hatred in her eyes, and told me I'd regret this. That I'd shown my true character, and she'd make sure my dad knew what kind of person I really was. And then she left, slamming the door so hard our cat hid under the couch for 2 hours. I stood there, literally shaking. I don't know if from rage or shock or what. And when Brandon came home about an hour later, he found me crying on the kitchen floor. I told him everything, every detail of the conversation with Ruth, and his reaction was complete disbelief followed by fury. I'd never seen Brandon really angry before. He's a calm guy generally, but he was furious. He said he couldn't believe someone could be so manipulative and sick, and that we needed to talk to my dad immediately. But before we could do that, Ruth got there first. She told my dad her own version of the story, a version where I supposedly had said horrible things about Samantha being a burden and useless who could never get a man on her own, and that I'd said Ruth had been a terrible mother who had only stayed with my dad for his money, all completely made up. But Ruth told it with so many specific details that my dad believed her. My dad called me that night absolutely devastated. He wouldn't let me explain. Just yelled at me over the phone saying he couldn't believe I could be so cruel to Samantha and Ruth, that he'd raised me better than that, and that if that's what I really thought of them, then maybe he shouldn't go to the wedding after all. I begged him to let me explain what really happened, but he said Ruth had no reason to lie, and I'd clearly shown my true character under pressure. He hung up before I could say anything else. Brandon and I made the decision to postpone the wedding. Not cancel it, just postpone it until we could sort out this family mess. I contacted the venue, explained there was a family emergency without giving details, and luckily they were understanding and let us reschedule for 3 months later with no additional charge. I called the few guests we had to tell them the wedding was being temporarily postponed, and everyone was kind, although I'm sure they were confused. I moved completely into Brandon's house after that, not because I wasn't already living there, but because I emotionally cut ties with my dad and Ruth. I didn't contact them, didn't answer their calls or messages, just focused on maintaining my sanity and my relationship with Brandon intact. My dad was apparently furious about this, because about 2 weeks later he posted something on Facebook about how he'd raised a daughter who had turned her back on her family in their time of greatest need, that I'd said horrible things about my disabled sister, and that anyone who was my friend should know the truth about my character. That Facebook post started a whole wave of drama. Relatives I barely knew started sending me messages asking if what my dad had said was true. High school friends commenting in shock, and basically my reputation being publicly destroyed. I tried to respond to some messages explaining there was another side to the story, but without going into details because I didn't want to make a public spectacle of all this. But the damage was already done. People had formed their opinions based on what my dad had shared, and I was the villain who had abandoned her poor disabled sister. It was at that point that my grandma, my biological mom's mom but who I'd maintained occasional contact with over the years, called me. She was like 70 years old, lived in a house in the country a few hours away, and hadn't been very involved in my daily life, but had always been sweet when we talked. She told me she'd seen my dad's post, that something didn't sound right to her, and that she wanted to hear my side of the story. I told her everything, absolutely everything, and as I talked I realized how much I'd been repressing for years. Not just this incident with the wedding, but the whole toxic dynamic with Ruth. Years of feeling like I owed my existence to someone, the constant manipulation. My grandma listened to everything without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence before she said, "That woman is a snake, and your father is a fool for not seeing it." My grandma had a plan. She told me to come to her house the following weekend, to bring Brandon, and that she'd take care of fixing things. She didn't tell me how, just asked me to trust her. Brandon and I drove to her house that Saturday, and when we arrived, we found this small ceremony set up in her backyard. There were flowers, there was an officiant who was the local church pastor my grandma had known for decades, and there were like 10 people there, including some aunts and cousins my grandma had clearly recruited. We got married that day in my grandma's garden, with the sun setting behind us and the neighbors' cows mooing in the background, which normally would be weird but honestly made everything more perfect somehow. It wasn't the wedding we'd originally planned, but it was better because it was genuine and full of people who really supported us. My dad wasn't there, Ruth and Samantha obviously weren't, but my grandma was, and that meant everything. After the ceremony, my grandma pulled me aside and explained the second part of her plan. Turns out she had some money saved up, not a fortune but a decent amount, and she was going to tell my dad she was planning to divide it among her grandchildren in her will, which included me. She told me she'd tell my dad she wanted to talk to Ruth about how to make sure Samantha was financially cared for in the future, and she was sure Ruth would show her true character if she thought there was money involved. I wasn't completely sure the plan would work, but I trusted my grandma. She contacted my dad about 2 weeks after our secret wedding, told him she wanted to meet to discuss important family matters, and that Ruth should be present too. My dad apparently agreed, probably thinking my grandma was going to help convince me to apologize or something. The meeting was at my grandma's house. My dad and Ruth arrived together. Samantha stayed home with a nurse, and my grandma offered them tea and cookies like this was just a simple social visit. Eventually, she brought up the topic of money, said she was updating her will, and wanted to make sure all her grandchildren were taken care of, and that she had approximately $150,000 she planned to divide among them. According to what my grandma told me afterwards, because I obviously wasn't there, Ruth's eyes literally lit up when she heard the amount. She immediately started talking about how Samantha would need that money more than anyone, how her medical needs were expensive, and how it would be fair for Samantha to receive the largest portion or even all of it considering her situation. My dad tried to say it should be divided equitably, but Ruth interrupted him saying I clearly didn't need the money because I had a husband who would support me now. My grandma let Ruth keep talking, even encouraged her, asking questions about what exactly Samantha needed, how long the money would last, that kind of thing. And then Ruth, thinking she already had the money in the bag, started complaining about me. She said I'd always been selfish, that I'd refused to help Samantha when it really mattered, that she'd very reasonably asked me to reconsider my marriage for Samantha's sake, and I'd reacted horribly and dramatically. My dad apparently stayed quiet during this part, and my grandma kept asking specific questions. What exactly did you ask her to do? And Ruth, probably so focused on getting that money that she didn't think about the consequences, explained everything. She told my grandma she'd asked me to cancel my wedding and convince Brandon to marry Samantha instead of me, that this was a reasonable thing to ask given everything Ruth had done for me over the years, and that I'd been cruel and heartless in refusing. What Ruth didn't know was that my dad hadn't told my grandma that specific part when he explained the family drama to her initially. He'd mentioned a fight but not the exact details, probably because deep down he knew it sounded absolutely insane. So my grandma was hearing this for the first time, and my dad was also hearing Ruth's version for the first time without Ruth's filter telling it to him directly. My grandma told me she saw the exact moment my dad realized he'd made a horrible mistake. He was sitting in the kitchen, drinking tea, while Ruth talked in the living room, and apparently his face went from confusion to shock to absolute horror as Ruth kept describing what she'd asked as if it were completely normal. He got up and went into the living room and asked Ruth to repeat exactly what she'd asked me to do. Ruth, still not understanding she'd dug her own grave, repeated it. She explained to my dad that she was just trying to give Samantha a chance at happiness, that I owed this to the family, and that it was unfair for Samantha to have to suffer, watching her sister marry the man she loved. My dad asked her directly if I'd really said all those horrible things about Samantha that Ruth had reported to him, and there was a pause long enough for the answer to be obvious. Ruth tried to defend herself, said maybe she'd exaggerated a little, but the intention behind what I'd said was cruel anyway, and my dad basically exploded. He yelled at her about how dare she lie to him about his daughter, how could she ask something so absolutely insane of someone, and how she'd manipulated this whole situation to make me look like the bad guy when she'd been the one acting completely irrationally. Ruth tried to get my dad on her side, reminded him that Samantha was his daughter too, that Samantha had been depressed and everything Ruth had done was out of love for her daughter. My dad told her that loving your daughter didn't justify destroying another person's life, and there was a huge difference between supporting Samantha emotionally and asking someone to sacrifice their entire future to fulfill an impossible fantasy. My grandma eventually had to intervene because my dad and Ruth started yelling at each other in her living room, and she has neighbors who were probably listening to everything. She told them to leave, that they clearly needed to have a more private conversation in their own home, and that, by the way, there wasn't $150,000. She only had like $10,000 in savings, and had lied about the amount to see Ruth's true reaction. Ruth apparently turned purple with rage when she realized she'd been tricked, but couldn't do much more than storm out of my grandma's house. My grandma called me that same night to tell me everything, and honestly, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I felt vindicated, obviously, but also sad, because this whole mess had been necessary for my dad to see the truth. She told me my dad wanted to talk to me, but she'd suggested he wait a few days to process everything and decide what he wanted to do with his marriage first. My dad called me about 3 days later. He was crying, which was rare because my dad wasn't the type to cry, and he apologized for not believing me, for sharing that horrible Facebook post, for doubting me when he should have defended me. He told me he'd kicked Ruth and Samantha out of the house, that he'd started divorce proceedings, and that he'd understand if I didn't want to forgive him. But he hoped we could rebuild our relationship eventually. It was a long and complicated conversation. I told him I was hurt, that he'd chosen to believe Ruth over his own daughter without even hearing my side, and that the Facebook post had caused real damage to my reputation and relationships. But I also told him I loved him and wanted to work on rebuilding trust, but it was going to take time. He agreed, said he'd do whatever was necessary, and asked me about Brandon and if we'd gotten married anyway. I told him about the ceremony at Grandma's house, and I think that hurt him a little because he realized he'd missed walking his daughter down the aisle. But he also said he understood why we'd done what we did and just wanted us to be happy. He asked if he could meet Brandon again officially, and I agreed to have dinner all together in a couple of weeks. It's been about 4 months since all this. My dad finalized his divorce with Ruth 2 months ago. She and Samantha are living with Ruth's mom in another state. Ruth never apologized to me directly. She told my dad she'd only been trying to do what was best for her daughter and any mother would do the same, which is obviously completely delusional, but, well, and that's her way of justifying it. I guess. My dad and I see each other about every 2 weeks for dinner or lunch. We're slowly working on rebuilding trust. He deleted the Facebook post and posted a vague apology without going into details about what really happened, which was fine, I guess. I didn't need all the drama to be public. Some relatives have reached out to apologize for judging me without knowing the full story. Others just disappeared. Which is honestly fine because I don't need people in my life who form opinions so quickly without asking questions. Brandon and I are good, better than good. This whole mess somehow made us stronger because we went through something horrible together and came out the other side still loving each other. And we occasionally talk about having a proper wedding celebration for all the friends who couldn't come to Grandma's ceremony. But honestly, I'm not in a hurry. We're already married, we already have our life together, the rest is just details. My grandma visited me last week, brought a cake she'd baked and some photos from the wedding she'd printed and framed. She told me she was proud of me for standing my ground, for not letting Ruth manipulate me, and for building a life with someone who really loved me. And when she said it, something in my chest loosened, like I'd been waiting for someone to tell me that for years. I thanked her for believing in me when my own father didn't, for doing whatever was necessary to reveal the truth, and for giving me the wedding I deserved even if it wasn't the one I'd planned. I think I'm going to be processing all of this for a long time still. There are days when I'm angry. When I think about all the ways Ruth manipulated me over the years and how I didn't see it more clearly. There are days when I miss Samantha, because despite everything, she's my sister, and I know it's not really her fault that Ruth used her as a weapon in this sick situation. And there are days when I'm just grateful that everything came to light, before I sacrificed even more of myself trying to keep the peace with people who never really valued me. Brandon asked me last night what I was thinking because he saw me looking at the photos from Grandma's wedding, and I told him the truth. I told him I was thinking about how sometimes the families we choose end up being more important than the families we're born into, and that I was grateful to have chosen him, and that my grandma had chosen me when I needed it most. He kissed me and told me he'd chosen me too, and would keep choosing me every day. And that's enough for now, I guess.